How you guys doing? First of all, thanks for sticking around. I know it's been a long day. So we will, hopefully be talking about some interesting stuff. And, at the end of this, we're going to have a little Q&A. So, feel free to ask us questions. So I'll tell you a little bit about us. I am the founder of a company called Ashe Avenue. We're a web development company that is based in Brooklyn. We have our main office is in Greenpoint. We have another office in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So we're all over the East Coast. Excuse me. We've been around for about 7 years now in the web development world. We've seen a lot of the great evolution of all the stuff that's happened since the Web 2.0 good old days to whatever the brave new world is that we're in now. So yeah, a little bit about us. One of the, we do a lot of work with startups, app companies, advertising agencies, interactive agencies, but probably our most sort of requested expertise is in the field of media and content publishing. So some of our clients include companies like AOL, Vice Media. We just recently redid the hightimes.com site. So we've spent a lot of time in this field, and I thought, it would be a nice opportunity for us to sort of talk about some of these things. As we've seen, there's a lot of trends happening right now that, in editorial especially, that really we thought would be nice to shine a light on. So, kind of the, actually, I'll introduce Tim as well. Tim is our lead developer.
Hello.
Tim's been with the company for about a year now and has helped us advance greatly into, like I said, the brave new world of all the technologies that we get to play with today. So kind of the point of this talk is what we wanted to discuss was, this is more of a sort of philosophical discussion. So we're not going to be showing you like code samples or, giving you design recommendations or anything like that. What we're really going for is to sort of show you a problem or, sort of issues that could potentially be arising in the content management world in the coming years, and just sort of, like I said, shine a light on it to help, help just escalate some thought and really get people focusing on some of these new trends. Let's see here. So yeah, in addition to these companies, we actually we have some friends that work at CNN, New York Times, New York Daily News, Huffington Post, a few others that we, really wanted to sort of get into it with and find out, more about their content management systems, as well as, like I said, we've done a lot of work with these companies that are sort of a mid-size entity. So, a little bit about those types of things. There are three-ish main buckets for content publishing. The biggest one, you'll have sort of major corporate structures like CNN, New York Times, that have. A lot of those will have like proprietary systems that are catered to, very broad, sort of the main journalistic method that are a little more, focused on totally different things than other entities. The mid-sized publications are, people like Vice is a good example that they do a ton of content publishing on a ton of different verticals. In a ton of different languages, different countries around the world. So they have a completely different set of needs than, say the New York Times. And then you have, smaller blogs, smaller more sort of rapid content type publications that really have, again, a totally different set of needs. So the point of this graphic is really to show you that, there's those three things, and then the asterisk in the middle represents the fact that there's not really any sort of silver bullet for accomplishing all of the functional needs that your back end is really going to need to accomplish. Really the key thing to note is that as designers and as UX developers and people who focus on user experience, the key is to make sure you do just that in the in the content and management side of your platform, of your application as well.
So we have learned through a lot of painful experience that the vast majority of CMS design and development, well, at least obviously development, the vast majority of CMS design gets relegated to developers. Designers end up spending a lot of time thinking about the experience that the user of the content is going to have, and very little time thinking about the experience that the manager of the content is going to have. Developers, unfortunately, are not very good designers in most cases. Developers generally start out by laying down basic building blocks of a content management system that are based on data. And the developer is very idealist about it. The developer thinks, I'm going to build this very simple square system, and it's going to have, it's going to be a car that has 4 doors on it, and it's just going to go straight down this perfect road, and this road is straight, and there's no traffic on the road. Developers tend to think of the data and the content instead of how it's going to be used. And as a result, a standard content management system created by a developer ends up being quite bad in most cases. Oh, it's really blurry, unfortunately. But this is basically content management to a developer, right? It's got all the content, and you can manage it, right? It doesn't have any real concept of how the content is being used or being presented. It's simply a vehicle for the database, or a mask over the database, or a facade over the database. There's usually a lot of extra things thrown in there too, like random pictures. And this isn't really great. It's not even remotely great. It's not something that does the content justice, because as soon as you put that in front of an editor, the editor either has no idea what to do with it, or they see that road that you imagined more like a spaghetti junction. They see traffic. They see options. They see a million different forks they could take. They see levels, decks, everything. They see the 1,800 buttons in the car, right? If you get, a good car these days will have, 50 or 60 different things you can do just on that little console right there. And if you just plop that in front of an editor, the editor, they don't know what to do. They're not going to just start clicking around. That's something developers do, right? That's not something an editor or a content manager does. And the negative side effects of putting this in front of your content manager, it ends up hurting the front-end product as well, right? It ends up making it so that they can't focus on what they really want to do, which is, say, sell newspapers or sell content subscriptions, or more importantly these days, show ads.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because what that sort of translates to, from a managerial perspective, is that, when you are putting these impositions on people, on your editors, then your front-end product could actually end up suffering. If it's hard for a person to say feature, they're writing a new article and they need to feature it on the homepage, but they need to also add in certain metadata, and it's going to take them an extra 30 minutes to do, then especially for a company like, say, the New York Times that needs to get breaking stuff out super quick, then that's really going to sort of hurt your credibility. It's going to hurt. It's just going to hurt throughout. And then additionally, if you're an editor who has to spend an extra 30 minutes per post doing this kind of stuff, then any manager should be able to see that and translate that into simple economics. If you're spending 2 hours a day on top of your normal editorial process, just dealing with your content management system, then there's a very discrete dollars and cents that can be associated with that.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about specifics of designing content management system. We're not going to talk, code, but it really comes down to a fundamental difference between focusing on the data itself versus focusing on how the data is being used. And the editor is never going to see the database or understand or care about the relationships between data. They're not going to care about large blocks of content in their raw form. I don't want to belabor the point, but this is a very, very standard practice. Is that let's say you build a content site for someone, and you focus all your energy on the front end, And you might even mock up data while you're building the front end. And then a day before the deliverable, you're like, oh, we better put a CMS in place real quick, right? Or you will use a CMS out of the box, something like Drupal, WordPress, whatever, and then not style it or change it or refine it or anything. Just take the packaged version of it and send it on to your client. And it really ends up costing you a lot of extra time. And in the client and the agency world, time is, of course, that's lost margin on our part if we have to spend more of our time training people for things that we didn't expect from the beginning. The developer's job really is to model data, to build a data model, to refine that data model such that it represents the real world. But it's the designer's job to put a facade on that. Not necessarily just a superficial facade, but to put a view on that and to put a perspective on it that represents the editor. We're going to talk a little bit about the editorial process. But to get an idea of how this can be applied, though, you might have 20 data fields that make up the concept of an article or a post. But there might only be 3 or 4 of them that an editor cares about at any given point in time for a specific task. So it makes logical sense that you shouldn't just expose them, 20 fields so they can do whatever they want with it. If their task is X and X includes 3 fields or 3 pieces of data, then show them those 3 fields of data and let them manage those that way.
Yeah, and so that's another, it's a pretty common oversight you see, especially with, I presume that a lot of the people at this conference are designers. So, there's a very common trend that we see in these types of companies where, your process when you're designing a web experience for anyone is that you spend time really focusing on, you write user stories. You come up with who the different, what's your audience segmentation? How will those people use the front end of your website? How will a person who just wants to visit the site and watch a video differ from a person who wants to come buy a shoe? So really the question becomes, why not apply those same theories to developing content management systems? It's very valuable, and we've actually found it to be extremely valuable to sit down with those major stakeholders at the beginning of a project and say, okay, how do you use your current content management system? What do you hate about it? What do you like about it? And then really go through that whole process of developing the user experience, developing wireframes, developing user stories, all of the basic tenets of creating UX guidelines, UX documents that designers are very familiar with already. Just applying that to the back end, the CMS.
So let's start to put this in practice a little bit. Let's take some steps towards figuring out what should actually be in a content management system. Are any of you guys familiar with Stephen Covey? He's like a pretty noted leadership coach. He actually just passed on a couple years ago, but he obviously spent a lot of his career writing and talking about habits and efficiency. But he also in 1994 wrote a book called First Things First. And it's really about personal effectiveness. And it's not a design book at all. There's this really great design lesson in it, in which it's essentially an object lesson in which he talks about having a bucket. And along with that bucket, you have a bag of pebbles. And those pebbles represent like the minutia of life, right? Taking out the garbage, or paying a bill, or going grocery shopping, or getting gas in your car, right? All the things that if you just poured that bag into the bucket, you would fill up the bucket, right? It's basically a never-ending supply of minutia. But then if you actually have large stones along with those pebbles, we're actually using donuts and jelly beans instead. If you have large stones that represent the important things in life, like say family or work or service or the really truly important things to you, if you try and put those into the bucket after the pebbles are already in it, you won't have room for it. You won't be able to fit everything into the bucket. By the same token, though, if you start with an empty bucket and put all the big rocks in first, and then try and pour the pebbles over, somehow magically there's room for everything. And it's because the pebbles fill in all the cracks around the important things. The lesson being that you should focus on the most important things first. And even if that's all that's in the bucket, it's still a pretty full bucket, right? But if you focus on the little things first, you won't have room for the big things later. It's a really, really great design principle. Obviously, it applies to developers, it applies to UX people, that you have to focus on the most important things to an editor in this case, right? And the most important tasks, the 4 or 5 most important things to whoever's going to be using your content management system.
Okay, so this is to get in a little bit to kind of the science and the thought process behind how we tend to approach these things. These are kind of the 3 basic things that we see as the most important to an editor. Editor meaning a person using the CMS. And these line up very closely with a lot of the sort of practices that programmers tend to hold near and dear. And it's, although a programmer, a lot of these talks we've been to today is programmers like to refer to themselves as lazy, which is absolutely true in my case. But it's the real point is that you need to just ensure that the least amount of work and the least resistance possible is what you're providing to people. So that that goes along with number 1 pretty closely, which is convenience. An editor needs to be able to just get to the CMS when they want to, needs to be able to use those functions that they have to do on a daily basis as simply and as easily as possible, and not hit them with stopping blocks like having to go through 40 screens to find their article, and then each screen takes 30 seconds to load. Then that's kind of how you get into the real overhead. Minimal repetition, dry programming is something that most developers are familiar with at this point. Stands for don't repeat yourself. And that's kind of the same thing here. With an editor, imagine the scenario of somebody who needs to do something in bulk form. Like say there's some metadata or something that needs to be changed for 50 articles. If that's a common task that people are doing regularly, then you should think about that in terms of, yes, your system will work that an editor can go into each of these 50 things and update one field to be exactly the same, but that's going to take them 50 times longer, ultimately, to do than just being able to do that in bulk, in batch form. So really identifying how the editor is going to use the site and trying to predict where those repetitive tasks are going to be happening is crucial, because then you can help eliminate those and again, reduce the overhead. And then again, simplicity is kind of an obvious one, I think, but it should be hammered home that that's a very, very important one to consider, and especially more so when you get into like roles of different users. There could be somebody who maybe just posts photos on a site, and that's all they do. So how do you make that experience as simple as possible for that person to do those tasks? Let's see here. I can change it. So to break it down a little further, these are kind of the 4 main, at least the largest buckets, which editors really sort of work with. These are kind of the 4 main steps of any piece of content getting published. Especially with different types of platforms, this may vary a little bit. There may also be other smaller things, but we've kind of found over the years that these are kind of the 4 biggest ones. Content development is the first step. Obviously, that's what that means is like writing a story, putting together the actual content, creating what it is that a writer or a journalist creates. And it's really what the user is going to consume. The visitor to your site is going to ultimately consume. Asset management is another one that's more common in larger companies. What that means is things like image management, video management, larger assets that may be passed around to different types of content, or have other very strict and very specific requirements for usage. That can be a very important thing on some platforms, and again, could be a very minor part of others. Online preparation is a thing that in the field of journalism that hasn't really been a thing until more recently. And what that tends to mean is adding open graph data, adding SEO metadata, adding, summary text, and then, getting things ready so that, all those little details are, you've got your little thumbnail image over here, and you've got your, your list image there. Very detailed for, again, for all the different types of companies. And then publishing is, taking this thing that's been created and getting it live, getting it featured, getting it, where it needs to be on the site so that people can actually start consuming it. So what we kind of did here, just to help visualize it a little bit, is broken out the way that we've seen it sort of in the big 3 buckets from the Venn diagram that we showed at the beginning. Major news outfits. A lot of the people we spoke to at, for example, New York Daily News is a great example. They have a process which is very file-based. Their writers will spend a lot of time creating something similar like Microsoft Word file, let's say. They don't need to spend a lot of time in the actual content system creating content because they're doing it externally. So the idea there is to shrink it down as much as possible by just creating, say, an upload tool that will parse that information and turn it into the right data fields. The second thing would be asset management. Again, you can see here that it's very large for the bigger companies, and then it gets sort of smaller as you go down. That's typically because major news organizations really have to be concerned with rights management, DRM, or things like that, that do require a lot of additional overhead. So when you write a piece, or upload a piece in this case, it would go through the photo desk, and then they have to add all kinds of metadata there. Maybe you're uploading a video and somebody has to put in all the subtitles and then do all the credits and then do all the fact checking and stuff. That's typically very large in those types of things, whereas in mid-sized pubs and blogs, you really just have, a lot of times, especially with blogs, you might just pull something from Google image search, throw it up there, and you don't care if you have to go look for it again later. So asset management tends to be a little smaller of a priority for those types of things. Then we have the online preparation step. This is one that kind of will really vary by the specific entity. For example, someone that is more print focused, which is definitely not as common these days, may not have as much of a need for providing that metadata, all the detailed open graph data. They may not care if the Facebook data is different than like a tweet, like just an abbreviated tweet. But these types of things also can be very important. SEO is obviously extremely important for these types of companies. Like Tim said, impressions are kind of the utmost metric that you're going to get with any of this stuff. So making sure that's surfacing properly is crucial. But then when you get down into blogs, they really, a lot of those tools, like say WordPress, does a lot of that stuff, or you can get WordPress plugins that will automatically generate a lot of that stuff for you. So inherently it becomes less of a task that you actually have to worry about. And then the last step being publishing. Typically with blog platforms, you hit a publish button and it goes live. There are other instances where, in mid to large size organizations, you'll need to go through several rounds of editing. When something actually goes live, then it has to go through a cache maybe before it actually shows up. Or you have to go through several rounds of approvals, and the editorial process can get much, much longer. And then you also have to focus on featuring content and putting stuff on the homepage when it needs to be there. And sometimes that'll even go through like a different set of people. So, and again, that it will kind of depend on the specific organization and how their editorial process works, but this is just sort of a generalized example of that. And then again, even sort of to dig even deeper, these sort of timelines will definitely shift when you have different types of people working on these different things. So for example, a mid-sized pub may have a person that only posts photos, like I was saying before. They would not really have as much of a content creation phase because all they're doing is taking some photos that are coming from an outside source, probably a camera, probably could be that they're editing it in Photoshop or whatever, and then they're just uploading it. So in that specific case, for a mid-sized publication, those two would kind of be swapped in terms of length of time.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, this really is kind of the core of what we're trying to talk about today, which is that you can't build a generic content management system and slap it in front of any client, right? You could put a fourth or fifth line in here that represents the kind of client that you're working with, right? You find out the things that are most important for their specific case, and then you build a tool that represents that. As John mentioned, a blog, I mean, we actually recently launched a CMS for a client. Rather than being interested in long form, right, like these deep journalistic pieces where they would spend days writing them and going through all sorts of vetting process. They're basically like one step up from a tweet, right? It's maybe 3 lines of text and a picture, right? But they do that 20 times a day, and they serve ads on all of them, and that's their model, right? So it doesn't make sense that we would put a large interface in front of them in which they could do something more than just put some text in and upload a photo in most cases, right? And if we did give them additional information that they could fill out if they wanted to, I mean, I'm sure that could serve a purpose of keeping the data, 100% perfect in the mind of the developer. But from an editor's perspective, it simply doesn't make any sense. We want to talk a little bit about the future at this point. So we're going to, there isn't a lot of time left in our talk, first off, but there's a lot of variety, as we've mentioned. We've got 4 things that we think are happening right now and are going to become more, interesting in the next couple years. So hypermicro publishing is what I just talked about. If you look at someone who wants to publish, if you look at someone who's prolific on Twitter, right? If they wanted to, make money doing that, they might set up a blog, and they might create social content 50 times a day and work on growing their network of followers, right? Hypermicro publishing is growing. People want to be able to just become very, very prolific very, very quickly, right? They don't want to spend the time in many cases to create long-form journalism. So this is something that is starting to happen already, and you should definitely plan for it happening in the future. Maybe it's a CMS, or it's a platform that does nothing but show a video and a piece of text, right? Or something that has a SoundCloud embed and maybe no text, right? But something like Tumblr, right? I mean, Tumblr, but not using Tumblr, right? People want to create these things for themselves. The next big thing is storification. There's obviously a lot of new players in this right now. Storification means that it's not necessarily categorization of content, but it's a representation of a connection to other individual articles that are related to the same topic. This is really useful for a news site. Basically, people want to be able to pull a thread into a current event, and then as time marches on, as articles get added to, as events continue to happen and more journalistic pieces are created, that you can simply direct your user to additional articles in this, related to this story. It's really, really great, and in the political space, it's happening a lot in these political blogs. And we think we're going to see it a lot more, but this is something you have to account for when you're building a content management system. How easy is it for them to find those other articles that this is related to? How easy is it to create a new story, for example, and relate the content? The next one is, this one was a hard one to describe, but we call this single-use presentation, right? Imagine an article that the publisher wants to be completely unique from any other article as far as how it's laid out, right? The New York Times, for example, has made quite a splash in recent time, and everybody's jumping into this pool now of, what was it? It was the snowstorm article, right? It was a long-form article. It was really beautifully done on the front end, and there was a lot of cool new web tech in it. And they've done several articles like that since then. Newsweek is doing this now. The Atlantic is doing it. They all need to be managed from the same content management system, though. So how do you build a content management system from the beginning that's going to handle a variety of templates down the road? You can solve this. This is obviously, something that from a technical level, there's a lot of solutions, right? And maybe you have a slightly different front end that's still served by the same back end. But it really comes back down to the question of how do you build a back end that'll serve all of these needs. Right. The last thing is sponsored content. Again, most of these people pushing content these days are trying to make money. Sponsored content is something that's started to occur more and more. A lot of that comes in the form of a feed. So maybe 3 times a day or once a day, you pull in content from an external source and produce content in your own CMS from that. In some cases, the business might require the content to simply be shown as it is. In some cases, you might need to edit it. But being able to handle, make sure that an editor understands how to manage this content that may not be their own is something that's happening a lot. So not just from an aggregation perspective, but as far as like making that content mine is concerned. And then it's also important to note there are some major technical changes that are happening. And I won't go too far into that, but just take note of there is a squeezing of the stack that's happening, that the data layer is getting pushed a lot closer to the front, and the front is getting pushed a lot closer to the back as languages mature, next generation languages develop. Platforms as a service are making it so that you can do rapid committing, so you can make a change to your CMS and push it out there very, very quickly if you're doing cloud deployment. And that, again, is something that it's not just technical, because as you make a change quickly, then your editor picks up on that and they want other changes quickly, and you have to account for the fact that technical changes are making it so that the speed at which you support and improve your CMS is changing. It also means that you should be building it small from the beginning and then growing it. Build it small around core functions and then rapidly change it, right? Fail fast, etc. Get the core pieces in there and then continue to develop it. The last piece is, it's a little bit related to the first one, is there's a lot of abstractions being developed that make it so that non-technical people can do technical things, right? There's all sorts of things like Firebase and databasey things that can be done on the front end, like using things like Angular, for example. There's some really great abstractions that are making it so that non-technical people don't have to be as intimidated by technical things. This is going to make it so that your content management system has to account for the fact that they might or might not know what's under the covers. So take stock of the technical changes that are happening, even if they're not necessarily design related, but because they will have an impact on how your design is carried forward.
So yeah, just to wrap things up, I think these are kind of the 3 most important things if you don't take anything else away from this. Really, the first step in developing any sort of editorial platform should always be to study the UX, like try to come up with detailed user stories of how an editor is going to use the platform. And how different editors are going to use the platform. Just try to understand as much as you possibly can, because then you will have to do less work in the end to, as Tim said, try to fit in those big rocks. Always think big. Always look forward to the especially technical innovations, anything that's happening trend-wise on the internet. Really set your sights for an end game that may be far off in the future, but definitely start with just trying to accomplish the most minimal tasks and doing them well. Because really spending that focus on things at the smaller level will shine through, it'll help your platform last a lot longer. Additionally, there are other things you can kind of plan for, some more, there's a whole list of types of things that we typically ask clients about their future plans, which could be anything from, are you going to expand into other countries and other languages? Will you see other verticals emerge? New categories, new other types of content you may be presenting, and just trying to help account for that. So really, really looking for that, again, that silver bullet that'll just take care of all of this for everybody that you ever come across will never exist. But really spending some time at the outset looking into how your specific client or how your specific tool will be used. is the most important thing to just do for any UX person and for any platform developer. So yeah, thank you guys.